Why do Israel and the U.S. hate Iran in the first place? What has caused this animosity?
So it's a complex question, of course, and I think unfortunately there's much hatred going from all sides. I think if we just push aside the hatred and see, okay, what are the root causes of this conflict? The root causes of this conflict, in my view, is a geopolitical rivalry, particularly between Israel and Iran. When you take a look at Israel and Iran's history, they were actually close allies, secret
Hmm.
allies in the 1950s and 60s. And they were not close allies because of some ideological reason. There was some ideological incomparability that was important. The Shah, for instance, was first very reluctant to get close to Israel until Israel clearly chose the Western camp in the Cold War. But after that, the key things that pushed the Israelis and the Iranians together were actually common threats. They sensed the threat from the Soviet Union, and they sensed the threat from strong pan-Arab nationalist states in the region, Iraq under Saddam, Egypt under Nasser, that they viewed as threats. And as a result, they had common strategic imperatives. Those common strategic imperatives survived the Iranian Revolution. Because even after the revolution, the Soviet Union was still there. Iraq was even more powerful. And when Iraq actually attacked the Iranians in 1980, the Israelis were eager to help the Iranians, and the Iranians quietly accepted Israeli help because it made strategic sense for them. They had a war to fight. But another ideological dimension was added because of this new regime's ideological pan-Islamic identity. And the Iranians started using very aggressive rhetoric against the Israelis, predicting that Israel would fall apart, would not exist, rejecting its legitimacy, its right to exist, etc., etc. And for about 8, 7 years, the Israelis were not happy with it. But behind the scenes, they were still helping the Iranians
Are
because they
you
didn't
talking
pay that
about?
much attention.
Are you talking? So this is after the fall of the Shah. The Ayatollah's in power now.
Exactly,
The U.S. is.
exactly.
Do you think that some of that animosity and the reason why the Ayatollah started why Iran now under this new Islamic regime, why they started speaking that way was really because the United States at that point had majorly shifted its feelings towards Iran as well. At that when that happened, there
No,
was a
I
lot
think
of
it's a bit
aggression there.
separate. The Iranians took 52 American hostages,
Right.
diplomats hostage, and that's what really broke down the U.S.-Iran relationship. Now, from the perspective of the revolutionaries, they were doing so because the United States, for more than 25 years, had supported and trained the Shah's secret service, kept the Shah in power. The Shah was using a lot of torture, and the United States was totally cool with that as long as the Shah was in the Western camp. So there was a lot of anger against the United States as the enabler of the Shah. In fact, when 1953, it was the United States that made a coup in Iran and reinstated the Shah after the Iranians actually had a nascent democracy back then, and the United States got rid of the democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and reinstated the Shah. And after that, the Shah actually became much, much worse than he was.
Mm.
So the United States lost much of its innocence with the Iranian people. So it was a major falling out between the US and Iran over the revolution, the hostage crisis, but there wasn't that divergence between Israeli and Iranian interests. So the Israelis actually broke with the US and they were violating US sanctions. The US imposed sanctions on Iran. No more American weapons, no more American spare parts could be sent to Iran. And Iran's entire military was based on American weaponry. Uh, Israelis openly violated this. Ariel Sharon was on American TV in 1982 and say, yes, Israel is providing weapons and spare parts, American spare parts to the Iranians in the hope that the Iranians will once again come back and have a strong alliance with the Israelis.
Hmm.
And then the US itself was in on it because in 1986, despite sanctions, despite everything it was saying publicly, it turned out that the Reagan administration was secretly sending weapons to Iran through the Israelis, with the help of the Israelis, in the hope that once Ayatollah Khomeini died, Iran would return to the Western.
Hmm.
So you have a lot of secret dealings and dirty dealings. But what is really fascinating in all of this is that the type of enmity we see right now between Iran and Israel and with the assassination, as you mentioned, Iran's rhetoric against Israel, Iran's support for Hamas, Islamic Jihad, etc. All of that came in the 1990s, not in the 1980s when Iran was so much more revolutionary and ideological. It changed in the 1990s because the geopolitics changed in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, the last standing Arab army that could pose a military threat both to the Iranians and to Israel, which was the army of Saddam Hussein, was defeated by the United States and the UN coalition. And at the same time, the Soviet Union collapsed. So the two key factors that actually pushed the Iranians and Israelis closer together in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s were now off the stage. And a new geopolitical environment arose in which, guess what? The Iranians and the Israelis started to emerge as two of the most powerful countries in the region. And now they started to view each other as threats. In fact, you see it in the early 1990s in Israeli press, in which they start talking about that the actual new threat is not the Arab vicinity, the inner circle of Arab states surrounding Israel, because they were all defeated more or less. But now it was the Persian periphery. It was the Iranians, the outer circle that was the real threat. And this was a complete inversion of Israeli strategic thinking. In the 1950s, Ben-Gurion had put together this doctrine that was called the doctrine of the periphery, in which Israel was trying to balance the immediate Arab states surrounding it by creating alliances with the non-Arab states in the outer circle, in the periphery. And those states were Turkey, Ethiopia, but the most important one was Iran. Now it was reversed. The inner states were pacified. They had signed peace treaties with Israel because there was a belief that perhaps Israel will eventually agree to a two-state solution. And now the new threat, geopolitical threat, was seen as Iran. And ever since, that's when the Israelis started to push the United States to sanction Iran, isolate Iran, all of those different things, which is the opposite of what the Israelis were doing in the 1980s. There's a letter from Shimon Peres to Ronald Reagan in 1986, at a time when Hezbollah, which is an Iranian ally, had taken Americans hostage in Beirut. And this was something that Reagan personally was very upset about. And Peres says that you have to overcome the obstacles in Lebanon in order to bring Iran back into the Western. So back in the 80s, Israelis were the ones who were selling arms to Iran, telling the US to talk to Iran, and also telling the US not to pay attention to Iranian rhetoric because Iranian rhetoric was not important. 1990s, everything is reversed.
So, what is Iran trying to do? We hear them chant death to America, death to Israel. What is Iran's strategy, do you think, when it comes to Israel? Do you think they really want to eradicate the Jewish nation? Are they wanting and push all the Jews somewhere else, like to Europe or something? What do you think their end game is, their goal?
I don't think so. And I think it may sound strange to say that I don't think, but I actually don't think that that is their end game. First of all, Iran has the largest community of Jews in the Middle East outside of Israel itself. Iran has had a Jewish minority for 2,500 years. Iranian Jews actually like to point out that there's been Jews in Iran 1,000 years before there were any Muslims in Iran. So this goes back historically when Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, conquered Babylonia and freed the Jewish people from the Babylonian imprisonment. And 1/3 of the population actually voluntarily migrated to southern Iran, which was the Persian Empire, the main center of the world at the time. And the Iranian Jews of today are descendants of those Jews. So I don't think that is, if they wanted to just eliminate all Jews, they would have done so with their own Jews, and they haven't. That's not to say that they're not discriminating against Jews. That's not to say that there's not a lot of very, very negative things going on. But when it comes to the question, what is their end game? I don't even think that they actually would want to see Israel completely defeated. I think that part of the reason why the Shah was supporting Israel, because he was afraid that if Israel was not absorbing some of the Arab anger, that Arab anger would be directed towards Iran because of Iran's own historical problems with Arab states. And of course, we saw the Iraq-Iran war. Now, this regime, the Islamic Republic, has pursued a different strategy in which it is trying to overcome Arab-Persian tensions as well as Sunni-Shia tensions by its brand of political Islam, and is trying to create commonalities with the Arab populations of the region. And as a result, believes that he has a better chance, even if Israel is out. Although I don't think that they would entirely. I think they would probably prefer a much weakened Israel that is still there, is still somewhat of a tension, but something that is not entirely allowing Arab states to shift their gaze away from Palestine.
Interesting.
So, so again, it's very complicated.
Well,
There's
that's,
no purity in all of this.
I
The
mean, that's
Iranians have been talking a big pro-Palestinian game, but in the 1980s, as much as they were talking a lot, they were still dealing extensively with Israel.
right. I mean, it's pretty straightforward in my view. It's pretty clever. I mean, if there is a big what people don't understand is that in the Muslim world, the Al Qaeda's, the ISIS, the real Salafi Muslims, they hate more than anybody the Shia Muslims. That's who they hate more than anybody. That's who they believe they have a godly duty to kill. Right? Are Shias because they're worse than somebody who's Christian or some other faith. They're claiming to be Muslim, but they're practicing something totally different, and to them that is like the worst offense ever. So you're saying that Iran's strategy is okay, in order to lessen the hate that they have for us, the Sunni Shia war, we're on your side, guys. We both are against Israel.